Hey, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a really interesting look at Trump and his campaign promises, how those are stacking up against what he's actually been doing now that he's back in the Oval Office. You know what makes this deep dive so interesting?
What?
We're looking at all this through the eyes of a Russian political philosopher, Pavle Schos Schos.
Yeah. It's fascinating because we get this perspective that's outside of, the typical U.S. media bubble. And he really presents Trump as a catalyst, someone who speeds up the processes that are already happening within the U.S. and on the global stage.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit.
Yeah.
That idea of Trump as this disruptor, this force for change.
Right.
One of the big expectations with Trump coming back into office was that he was going to strike some sort of grand bargain with Russia.
Yeah, there was this widespread belief that Trump would find a way to reset U.S.-Russia relations, bring about this new era of cooperation.
Yeah, right.
But Schosen points out that there's this really fundamental disconnect in how the U.S. and Russia approach this whole relationship. He uses this really interesting analogy. Yeah. He says Russia wants a perpetual peace, like a lasting resolution to all the tensions between them. But the U.S. seems more interested in these temporary solutions, these Band-Aids that don't actually address the core issues.
So it's like they're speaking two different diplomatic languages. They're not even on the same page about what success would even look like.
Exactly. And that brings us to this idea of a June ultimatum that Schillen mentions. He says that in 2024, Russia issued this ultimatum, which outlines the absolute minimum that they'll accept for any kind of agreement with the U.S.
Okay.
But here's the thing. Schulzen says the U.S. doesn't seem to be taking it seriously at all.
Now, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's break that down. What is in this June ultimatum? I mean, it sounds pretty serious. It sounds like a make or break kind of moment in U.S.-Russia relations.
Well, the specific details of the ultimatum aren't really spelled out in what we're looking at. But Schofen really stresses that this represents like a non-negotiable baseline for Russia, And he makes this interesting point that the U.S. seems to think they can just promise things to Russia without considering how it'll impact their European allies. As if they can just act unilaterally and everyone's going to fall in line.
It's like they think global politics is just, the U.S. president picking up the phone and calling the shots.
Right. It's very naive.
Yeah.
And this gap in perception, that's a big theme that Schulzen keeps coming back to. Another example of this is how he looks at NATO expansion. Remember, Trump campaigned on the idea that he understood Russia's concerns about NATO moving eastward?
Oh, yeah. That was a big part of his platform. He even went so far as to say that NATO was obsolete.
Right. But Schulzen is really skeptical about whether Trump can actually deliver on those promises. He says that to reverse NATO expansion, you'd have to overturn 30 years of U.S. policy. This isn't just something that Biden came up with. It's deeply embedded in U.S. strategy.
So even if Trump wanted to roll back NATO expansion, he could just snap his fingers and make it happen.
Exactly. And then there's another layer to this. For Russia, the problem goes beyond just NATO membership. It's about any foreign military presence in Ukraine at all. Schirlin brings up a recent agreement between Ukraine and the UK for British military bases. That's something completely out of Trump's hands.
It's like every time Trump tries to open the door to better relations with Russia, there's another wall behind it.
That's a great analogy. And this actually brings us to another one of Schirlin's really interesting points. He talks about this idea of make Europe great again, which he sees as Trump's way of trying to gain control over certain key European governments.
Hey, make Europe great again. That sounds awfully familiar.
Right.
Like a spin on Make America Great Again.
Exactly. But here's how Schullen interprets it. He doesn't think it's really about making Europe stronger. He thinks it's about Trump putting leaders in place who share his own worldview and who will help him keep the promises that he's made to Russia. He sees it as Trump trying to outmaneuver this globalist faction that he sees as his enemy.
What's a global chess game? Where Trump is trying to strategically position his pieces.
Exactly. And we're actually seeing this play out in real time right now. Schulzen specifically points to the German elections coming up and the potential for the UK's Reform Party to gain more power. Those are examples of how Trump is trying to reshape the political landscape in Europe.
This is getting really interesting. It's like we're watching a political thriller unfold.
Yeah.
But it also brings up some really big questions about what this means for Europe.
For sure. And the stakes get even higher when we start talking about the potential for the Ukrainian conflict to become a second Vietnam for the U.S. Steve Bannon has been pushing that idea.
Yeah, I've heard that argument.
Yeah.
The idea is that the U.S. military-industrial complex has so much influence that it's really hard for the U.S. to just walk away from a conflict.
Right. And Schulzen actually agrees with Bannon on that. But he makes a really important distinction. The Vietnam scenario that he sees is one where the U.S. withdraws, not necessarily one where the conflict escalates. He compares it to what happened with the Paris Peace Accords and the eventual collapse of South Vietnam.
So he's not talking about this long, drawn-out, bloody war. He's talking about a strategic retreat by the U.S. that could leave Ukraine vulnerable.
Exactly. And this actually leads to what Schos sees as a fundamental paradox in Trump's approach. Trump always talks about peace through strength, but how does that line up with the idea of pulling out of Ukraine and maybe leaving them to fend for themselves?
It does seem like those two ideas are clashing.
Right. That's the paradox that Schos points out. He argues that in this specific situation, peace through strength just isn't logically possible. The only way to get peace, he says, is for one side to admit defeat.
So someone has to back down.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like either the U.S. or Russia is willing to do that, and that leaves Ukraine caught in the middle.
Exactly. And Schos believes that this refusal to back down makes escalation the most likely outcome. He points to the Ukrainian leadership wanting to keep the West involved, and also these anti-Trump factions in Europe who want to see him fail as factors that could fuel the conflict even more.
Wow. It's such a complex situation with so many moving parts and different agendas. But in the end, it seems like Ukraine's the one who's going to pay the price.
It does seem that way. And Schos's analysis doesn't stop there. He goes on to explore some even deeper questions about Ukraine's national identity and the human cost of this whole geopolitical game that's being played.
This has been so eye-opening. I'm really eager to hear what Shawshank has to say about those deeper issues.
Yeah, so, where we left off was this idea that things are probably going to escalate in the Ukrainian conflict, driven by all these different players and their motivations on the world stage.
It's a pretty scary thought, honestly. It feels like Ukraine is just stuck in this web of all these competing interests. And no matter what they do, there are going to be consequences.
Right. Shoshlan doesn't sugarcoat anything here. He even suggests that Ukraine might get pushed to the point where they start targeting Russian infrastructure.
Wow, that's a huge escalation. Wouldn't that risk massive retaliation from Russia? It seems incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. But that's Shoshlan's point. Any escalation, even one that might seem justified from Ukraine's side, is ultimately going to hurt them the most. They're the ones right there on the front lines, and they've already been through so much.
It's really heartbreaking to think about. It's like they're trapped in this no-win situation.
Yeah, it really does feel that way. And this leads us to what I think is one of the most interesting and maybe even controversial parts of Shoshlan's analysis. This idea that Ukraine is dealing with an identity crisis.
An identity crisis? What does that even mean?
Well, Shoshlan says that there's this fundamental problem at the heart of what it means to be Ukrainian. He argues that Ukrainianness, as he calls it, just doesn't work with being a state. He uses historical examples to back this up, saying that every time Ukraine tries to assert its independence or break away from Russia, it ends up leading to conflict and suffering.
So he's saying that the very idea of an independent Ukraine is flawed. At least that's his take. It's a pretty bold statement.
It is, and it's definitely going to cause some arguments, but I think what Shoshlan's getting at is that Ukraine's got some really tough choices to make. They can try to keep things as they are, but that might mean giving up or even sacrificing some of their unique identity as Ukrainians, or they can fight to hold on to that identity. But that could mean even more conflict and destruction.
It's a horrible choice. It's like having to choose between existing and being who you are.
Exactly. And Shoshlan doesn't try to offer any easy answers. He just lays out this stark reality and leaves us to wrestle with how complicated it all is.
It's a good reminder that these geopolitical conflicts are never just about land or resources. They're about beliefs and history and the very soul of a nation.
You said that perfectly. And this actually brings us to another really interesting part of Shoshlan's analysis. His take on Trump's embrace of traditional values.
Right. That was a pretty big shift for Trump. What's Schillen's take on that? What's the strategy there?
Well, Schillen sees it as a really smart move from a strategic standpoint. He says that by aligning himself with traditional values, Trump is taking away one of the main arguments that Russia and other countries use. You know how Russia often tries to paint itself as the defender of traditional values, especially compared to the West, which they see as all liberal and decadent.
Right.
So, Shoshlan thinks that by adopting this language, Trump is forcing Russia to come up with a new ideological position. They can't just keep using this vague idea of traditional values to define themselves.
Like Trump is saying, oh, you want to play the traditional values card? Fine, I can play that game too. And maybe even better.
Exactly. Schoshlin believes that this is a bold move that could actually change the whole global ideological landscape.
It's like we're getting this behind-the-scenes look at how power works and all the rhetorical strategies being used in this global standoff.
Right. And we can't forget about the human cost of all of this. Schoshlin talks about that too. And it's really powerful what he has to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What does Schosselin have to say about how this conflict is affecting the Ukrainian people?
He talks about this widespread feeling of betrayal among Ukrainians. They feel betrayed by both the West and Russia. Like they're just pawns in this bigger game with no real control over their own fate.
That feeling of being abandoned, of being used, must be so hard to deal with.
It is. And Schoshlin argues that this feeling of disillusionment is made even worse by what he calls Ukrainocentrism.
Ukrainocentrism. You've mentioned that a few times. I'm still not quite sure I understand what that means.
Okay, so basically, Schoshlin describes it as this belief that Ukraine is somehow at the center of the world, that everyone owes them something. He says this idea has been around for decades, and it's led to these unrealistic expectations and a sense of entitlement that just can't hold up anymore.
So it's like this rude awakening.
Yeah.
After years of thinking they were so important on the world stage, now reality's setting in.
Exactly. And now they're facing aggression from Russia and what they see as weak support from the West. So this whole Ukrainocentrism is falling apart, and it's leaving a lot of Ukrainians feeling lost and unsure of where they fit in.
That's a recipe for despair. Where do they go from here? What can they hold on to?
Well, Schoshlin doesn't offer any easy solutions or pep talks. He frames their situation in these really existential terms. He asks this question that cuts to the core of their identity. What does it actually mean to be Ukrainian? He suggests that the answer might be in letting go of this need for validation from outside, for recognition as this special and unique nation.
So it's about finding their own internal compass, their own sense of meaning, instead of relying on others to tell them who they are.
Right. It's a tough message to hear, especially when they're going through so much. But Schoslin's saying that real strength and resilience come from inside, from a shared sense of purpose and community that goes beyond geopolitical goals.
It's powerful. It makes me think about how the most important journeys are often the ones we take inward to figure out who we truly are.
It is. And what's fascinating is that this idea of looking inward, of finding strength and meaning in something deeper than what other people think, actually connects back to Trump's focus on traditional values.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, think about it. When Trump talks about traditional values, he's appealing to something that goes deeper than politics. It's about family, community, faith. These are things that have been important to people throughout history across all kinds of cultures.
So in a way, both Trump and Schosselin are pointing us towards something bigger than this political chess match. They're both asking us to think about what truly matters in life, what gives us a sense of belonging and purpose.
Exactly. It's about realizing that even when there's conflict and uncertainty, there are these deeper truths and values that can guide us. Robert Schosslin goes on to say that this sense of betrayal that Ukrainians are feeling is actually made worse by what he calls Ukrainocentrism.
Ukrainocentrism. You keep using that word, but I'm still not totally sure I get it. What does it actually mean?
Okay, so think of it like this. Schosslin describes Ukrainocentrism as this deep-seated belief that Ukraine is like the center of the world. Like they're the main character and everyone is watching and owes them something. He says this view has been developing for years and it's created this sense of entitlement and these expectations that just aren't realistic.
So it's kind of like they've been living in this bubble thinking they're way more important on the world stage than they actually are. And now that bubble's being popped.
Exactly. And they're facing aggression from Russia and they feel like they're not getting enough support from the West. So this whole Ukrainocentrism thing is falling apart. And it's leaving a lot of Ukrainians feeling lost and confused about their place in the world.
It's got to be a tough pill to swallow to have your whole sense of identity and purpose shaken up like that. So what does Schosselin say they should do? How do they move forward from this?
Well, Schosselin doesn't really offer any easy answers or like a motivational speech. He frames their situation in a very philosophical way. He asks this really profound question: what does it actually mean to be Ukrainian? And he suggests that maybe the answer is letting go of this need for validation from other countries. This need to be seen as this unique and exceptional nation.
So it's more about finding their own internal compass, their own sense of meaning and strength, instead of relying on others to define who they are.
Right. It's a tough concept, especially when they're under so much pressure from the outside. But Schosselin argues that real strength comes from within, from a shared sense of community and purpose that goes beyond geopolitical goals.
It's a really powerful idea. I know. It reminds me of that saying, the longest journey is the journey inward. Like the most important journey we take is the one to discover who we really are.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that this idea of looking inward, finding strength in something deeper than what other people think, actually connects back to Trump's focus on traditional values.
Whoa, hold on. How do you see that connection?
Well, think about it. When Trump talks about traditional values, he's tapping into something that resonates on a much deeper level. It's about family, community, faith, things that have always been important to people throughout history and across cultures.
So both Trump and Shalin, in their own ways, are kind of pointing us towards something bigger than this whole political power struggle. They're asking us to think about what really matters in life, what gives us a sense of belonging and purpose.
That's it, Robert. It's about realizing that even in the middle of all the conflict and uncertainty, there are these deeper truths and values that can guide us.
Wow, this has been such an insightful deep dive. I really appreciate you walking us through Shalin's analysis. It's given me a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure, Robert. It's been a fascinating conversation. And, even if we don't have all the answers, I think Sheshelin's perspective really challenges us to question our assumptions and look at things from different angles, to really grapple with the complexities of the world we live in.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep digging into these ideas, explore the material we've talked about, and come to your own conclusions. That's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us.